Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Cottrell Digital Studio here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. Well, tomorrow is Halloween, October 31st, All Hallows Eve. And lo and behold, it is even chilly enough here in Northeast Georgia for me to actually get to wear a sweater. How can you have Halloween in 75 or 80 degree weather? We've done it, but not this year. So today, for our members-only broadcast, we want to talk just a little bit about the classic monsters that have really been at the core of what we as Americans consider spooky, consider horror, and they're very, very classic images. And as you can see the ones behind me, all you have to do is take a look and you start to pick those out and you know exactly who they are, or you more or less think you know who they are. And they just wrap themselves up in our national consciousness as these are the monsters, right? Well, now, we've called this one classic monsters. What do I mean by classic monsters? Well, of course, I've set up some rules since I'm in charge of the broadcast, but I think you'll see why I picked them. Classic monsters, of course, have to be classic Hollywood. That means it's, we're not talking, we're talking the early days of horror, the very early days of horror. We're not talking about, Freddy Krueger and Jason from Friday the 13th and things like that. We're talking about classic Hollywood from the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. We're talking about ones that are widely recognizable, really not as, they're almost memes, as we would say in this modern age. We see them and something becomes associated with them that we know exactly what that's supposed to be. We all recognize them and we all know that they carry a certain weight with them. And most of the ones we're going to be talking about today are from Universal Studios, and we'll get into why that is a little bit later, but Universal Studios are really the ones that the Film Institute that created a lot of these monsters and basically sort of created the early horror genre as far as American cinema goes. Almost all these stories that we'll be talking about today and the monsters that come with them come from classic literature or from history itself, or at least history. So they're all based in some sort of other expression of the written word, whether it's historical records, whether it's, very popular novels from all around the globe. But they have roots in classic literature that are then expressed onto moving pictures with the cinema. And of course, the early days of horror aren't really based upon people jumping out from behind a tree and saying boo. These stories, like the ones the written word they're based on, and when they're turned into something for the cinema, they're based on suspense. They're based on slow build. They're based on a growing fear, not a shock and surprise. And so when you go and watch these, if you haven't already, you're going to see that slow paced but very high burn where you just wait and you just wait and you just wait and you think something's going to happen. You know something's going to happen, but watching it happen is where the real spookiness is. Now, where did these monsters come from? How did the first horror movie start? And for that, one of the most popular and influential, we're actually going to shift from America and go over to Europe and look at German film in the 1920s. Now, of course, in the 1920s, we're in the era of silent film. There's no sound, but of course, these movies, even though there's no sound from the movie itself, would travel and there would be a soundtrack that would be played by a piano player or an organist in the theater. It would come with sets of sheet music, and as the film played, the piano player would actually play the tune as he watched the film, and as he watched it more, he would kind of get where the score was going to fit in. But I want to show you this German film from 1922 called Nosferatu. It's very loosely based on Bram Stoker's Dracula, and the figure is sort of a Dracula-esque person, but with this short clip, you'll sort of be able to see how a lot of these classic horror tropes came to be. And like I said, this was very influential and it carried on into a lot of subsequent films. Let's take a look. Now, some of that may seem corny to us, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but you have to put yourself into the early days of cinema, the early days of motion picture, when people are not used to seeing moving images. They've seen illustrations of things that are horribly creepy, but you notice there in the Nosferatu, that classic rise up straight, and hopefully one of the things you noticed were those long spindly fingers. And remember, they're moving and they're coming towards the camera, and just the novelty of seeing these things in motion was enough to make a lot of people in the cinema just lose their mind. But that's 1922. In 1925, one of the first great American horror classics comes to the screen, The Phantom of the Opera, starring Lon Chaney. Now, this, of course, is based on the French novel, The Phantom of the Opera. In a nutshell, it's about a person who was born horribly disfigured, but was very talented and loved music, and lived basically underneath the Paris Opera House. And as he grows up, he takes in all this music, and he wants to control it. He wants to set the destiny. He wants to pick who the ingenues in the Paris Opera are going to be. Even though he's horribly disfigured, he cannot show himself. And again, remember, this is in the early days of cinema, and therefore the early days of special effects. We are so far from computer-generated graphics, I can't even begin to describe it. So everything you're going to see in all of these films that we're talking about is 100% practical effects. Lon Chaney actually mutated and transformed his own face. So when you take a look at this, we're seeing the image of the Phantom just here. But again, the movie has a slow build, and probably the creepy climax of this movie is when Christine actually pulls the mask off of him and he's staring straight at the camera. And this picture is what people see. Lon Chaney darkened his eyes. He used makeup. He used a skull cap to raise his forehead up a couple of inches. He actually put wires in his nose so that it would spread them up like this, and used putty. He used false teeth ground down and placed them on his own teeth to get this look. This is unprecedented, and this freaked people out. There are several instances and anecdotes of when people were watching this in the theater for the first time, when the mask is ripped away and this is what's staring at the screen. There were people who fainted. There were people who screamed and ran out of the theater because this was so frightening. And again, we're talking about the silent era. This doesn't have any sound with it. This is a soundtrack being played in the theater itself, which kind of gives for lack of a better word, a musical 3D effect anyway. So The Phantom of the Opera in 1925 is Universal Studios really its first foray into the horror thing. It's not really thought of as a monster movie at the time. It's more thought of a telling of a very classic French novel, and yet the suspense, the makeup that creates this monster, the effect that it has on audiences is really something that sets the tone for Universal moving into the next decade. And actually, even later on in 1930, when talkies came out and movies began to have sound, they actually created a sound version of this. Now, they couldn't go back and talk to Lon Chaney. He was at another studio, and classic Hollywood, if nothing else, the studios were incredibly jealous of the actors they had under contract. It was negotiating like crazy if they had to go from one studio to the other. He was already at MGM. He was not available, so they had someone do some voiceover. They added a few scenes with talking dialogue and, of course, put a scored soundtrack over the movie itself. But this 1930 release is, they found one version of it. This is something about the early days of film, too, by the way. The original 1925 version, we only have a couple of small 16mm versions that are not very clean. So even the ones you have today that remastered are sort of a mix of those smaller, less clear 1925 exposure and the later 1930, and they even began to colorize part of it later on, but that's later. But Phantom of the Opera is here really as Universal's first big horror film. Now, the next one that we're going to talk about is really the one that sets the stage for Universal. 1931, Dracula. like Nosferatu, it deals with a vampire, but this one is the first, let's say, so when they made Nosferatu in Germany, they just borrowed from Stoker's Dracula. I'm sorry, not Stoker's Dracula, and didn't really qualify it. So Universal actually licenses with the novel and sort of bases it on the novel. And this is where you get this classic Transylvanian Count. And today, the image of Dracula, the classic image of Dracula that we have, all goes back to this performance by Bela Lugosi, and it follows the novel pretty closely. It has, the classic cape. It has the very, very dark features, the fangs that come out, and the accent of Transylvania, I want to suck your blood, right? This is where we get those things. And again, put yourself in this time frame. This is the first time they're seeing this Dracula. This is the first time they're seeing vampires like this. So it's, again, this sets the tone for what vampires and vampire movies are going to be from here on out, even up to the modern day. And we have another great video to show you to give you a sense of what this movie is like.
I am Dracula. A moment ago, I stumbled upon a most amazing phenomenon. Something so incredible, I mistrust my own judgment. Look.
Dracula. The very mention of the name brings to mind things so evil, so fantastic, so degrading. You wonder if it isn't all a dream, a nightmare.
Rats. Rats. Thousands. Millions of them.
But no, this is no dream. This is Dracula, the original terrifying story of a maniac and a man who lived after death, lived on human blood, took the form of a vampire bat, and lured innocent girls to a fate truly worse than death.
Dracula? Oh, what's he done to you, dearie? Tell me.
He came to me. He opened a vein in his arm, and he made me drink.
So that, of course, is the trailer for Dracula that would show in theaters to get people to come and see it. Interesting side note, isn't it interesting how trailers used to be? They'll show a lot of the movie just like the modern ones, but they also are still kind of trying to build that suspense without giving the movie away. But Dracula, of course, becomes that flagship for Universal Studios monster movies. And yet, Bela Lugosi does not reprise the role of Dracula until much, much later, about 1948. We'll come to that later. The next Universal horror movie with monsters is probably the most well-known, 1931's Frankenstein. Again, based on a novel by Mary Shelley. And it's a novel, when you read it, that asks a lot of hard questions about how far should science go? What is mankind's role in trying to figure out and become something that it shouldn't be? What is the nature of life and death? What is the nature of the afterlife? Lots of different things. To a certain extent, 1930s Hollywood took advantage of those questions, but again, to a certain extent, they're not really interested in exploring those too deep. Here is Boris Karloff, who becomes the quintessential classic movie monster. And you can see there, this is the look that everyone has. He's someone who is brought back to life by Dr. Frankenstein. Of course, many people know this, some people don't. This guy is not Frankenstein. This is Frankenstein's monster. Frankenstein is the mad scientist who brings about his experimentation and his research, taking body parts from graveyards and stealing a brain to put in this so that he can create life. And one of the most classic scenes is of that his laboratory. Notice I said laboratory. And they have the cadaver there, and he's using the power of lightning to bring the monster to life. And, you know, he's alive, he's alive. Very classic overacting. Just like with that Dracula trailer, notice that Hollywood is still making that transition in terms of cinematography and in terms of acting styles from the silent era, where things had to be much bigger, the movements had to be big, and the facial expressions had to be very exaggerated. They're still carrying that through even into the 1930s. And of course, Frankenstein sets up the classic monster motif following the same year as Dracula, right? We have Dracula, we have Frankenstein. These two are massive box office hits, and that's one of the big things that sets Universal up as the monster studio for easily the next decade to decade and a half. So the next movie we're going to take a look at, quickly following that same year, The Mummy. Again, you'll recognize the name, Boris Karloff. So this one isn't necessarily based on a novel or anything like that I'm aware of. This is inspired by Lord Carter finding the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. He found this in 1922, but again, for the next decade after that, there was this huge buzz about Egyptology and all the mystique surrounding the finding of that mummy. Well, of course, when people get their imaginations and get a hold of a story like that, you're going to have mummies coming to life. That's the basis of The Mummy and all of the subsequent sequels, is someone who was cursed in the ancient world of Egypt, has been a mummy for thousands of years, and then when the tomb is discovered, the mummy comes to life to either seek revenge on those who awoke him or to find his long-lost love, who was a princess in Egypt. Boris Karloff, of course, he's sort of the machine, the horror machine, right? You can see here he's a big man. He's very good at having those motions. And one of the classic things you'll notice about the mummy as he portrays him and as other people portray him is he's got all the bandages wrapped around him. His right arm sort of always stays here, and it's the left arm that always sort of goes out to do the bad things, and he always walks with a lurch. I mean, he's 3,000 years old. He's going to have a limp. He's been cooped up in that sarcophagus for so long. So 1931, Dracula, Frankenstein, Mummy really set the pace for Universal going into the future. To make this success something that continues, they began pulling in a lot of different stories. And in 1933, they get another one, The Invisible Man, played by Claude Rains. I personally love Claude Rains. He's always good in all the movies he's in. And in this one, he basically goes mad. And that's, I think, one of the appealing things about this. This movie has two really appealing things to the audiences of the early 30s. Number one is just watching and listening to this fantastic actor slowly go mad. The premise is that this scientist creates a serum that when he takes it, turns him invisible. Who wouldn't want that, right? But it also makes him insane. And so the movie shows this insanity coupled with this seeming power to do whatever he wants. And as he goes mad, people begin to see this, and he, in effect, terrorizes them. This is also a big hit, and this is 1933 when he unwraps the bandages from his head, and there's no head there. We're talking about the absolute height of innovative special effects. This movie is full of special effects because of the invisible tricks that he has to do on screen, and they do a great job. They do a couple of versions of, it's not really green screen like we have here at the Cottrell studio. It's sort of a black screen. They put him in a black bodysuit and then have him put a suit over that, and then they film him doing things against a completely black background and then superimpose other images. It's really neat. If you want to go look at some of the special effects for that, it's sort of the beginnings of that sort of thing. But The Invisible Man also has some sequels that come out, but he's also in that early range. Now, the next one is The Werewolf of London in 1935. And this is not... The Werewolf's interesting because it's played by a couple of different people. This is sort of This is the first movie that Hollywood does that portrays a werewolf on screen, someone who changes from a man into a wolf. And it's interesting. It doesn't really happen because of a full moon yet. That's something that happens later. But this one isn't quite as popular as the one that comes later, and we'll come to that one. But it's the one who sets up the werewolf as a classic universal monster. Of course, he chases girls. People try to get him. He lumbers around in the woods at night. Super creepy, played by Henry Hull. I just kind of want to mention this one so that when we get to the other one, there'll be some basis that this is the first one, but it's not the most well-known one. Now, probably the most successful sequel in movie history. 1935, Bride of Frankenstein. This is a classic, and just the image of Elsa Lanchester, who played the Bride of Frankenstein, is one of those images, arguably more than Frankenstein himself, that sears itself onto the popular consciousness. I mean, look at this picture. Everyone knows who the Bride of Frankenstein is, that giant hair, that shock of white running through it. When she turns her head up to scream, you can see the scars where Dr. Frankenstein has sewn her together. The premise of this movie is that poor Frankenstein's monster needs some companionship that he can relate to. So he goes and he finds a woman, or at least a series of womanly parts, sews them together, uses the same process to create life in his lab as he did with the original monster. And the problem is that when she is finally awoken and prepared and presented to her future husband, she is absolutely terrified. She does not want to be with him. And as a result, Frankenstein's monster becomes, as you can imagine, incredibly impressed. We all get to hate turned down by that first love, and destroys the castle, destroys her and everything else. But this is a classic, and we have some great video so that you can see that interaction between all these great actors.
Raise the cosmic diffuser. Remove the diffuser bands. She's alive! Alive!
Looks like she was about to fall in love with the wrong person. Careful when you play God like that. So, Bride of Frankenstein, perfect acting there. And again, just she's absolutely beautiful, even with that hair. I think the hair is what makes it so amazing, which is also something to remember when we're talking about these classic monsters. It's not just the directing. It's not just these fantastic actors on screen. It's all the people, the costumes, the makeup, the set design. There's a lot that goes into these to make them just right. And it really, really tells because, you know, Lon Chaney did his own makeup for Phantom of the Opera, but by the time we get to this point, there are entire crews of people that are working on the costumes, working on the makeup, working on the hair that pull all of this together. It's a true Hollywood effort. Now, next one, I want to get to 1941, just before World War II breaks out, we get The Wolfman, and this is the one we usually think of when we think of werewolves. Lon Chaney Jr., who is, of course, Lon Chaney's son, and he carries a lot of cachet with that name in Hollywood and in the horror industry, takes on the role. And this is something where the special effects of the time are able to, they've improved a lot, even over the last 10 years. And we've got a video now I want you to see that shows some of the transformation and how we get to this classic werewolf. Have you ever noticed how people in the movies in a full moon at night in a graveyard seem totally unconcerned about their condition until the thing that gets them gets them? If you're going to be a gravedigger, don't do it at night, people. That is definitely a day shift job. Just my 2 cents of advice for those looking to make that a career. Anyway, you see the, again, suspense. You see the transformation effects and the special effects that go into something like that. And of course, this movie being made in 1941, we all know what happens at the very end of that year. World War II kicks in. And you would think in some ways that might actually limit what Hollywood is able to do. They're definitely going to start transforming a lot of their productions and a lot of their efforts into supporting the war effort. But they also know, and the government supports them on this, that people are still going to need to be entertained. They're still going to need something fun to look forward to at the end of a 50 or 60 hour work week at Bell Bomber or at the shipyards. And so they continue to make movies, and including a lot of horror movies. And we can see that there are lots and lots and lots of sequels on this next slide. And so in the 30s and going up on into the 40s, you have Universal taking this very great success, and they just keep cranking out movies. And that's something you have to remember about classic Hollywood too, is because of the way production is set up, the way they have the studio system, they can crank movies out pretty quickly. Now, it's not quite the way it used to be in the late 20s and early 30s, but where they could do a movie from beginning to almost release in 2 or 3 weeks, but they are able to crank these out. So you see, tied into these, there are a lot. Daughter of Dracula, Son of Frankenstein, Son of Dracula, The Mummy's Hand, Revenge of the Invisible Man, The Invisible Woman, The Mummy's Tomb, Frankenstein and the Wolfman, Mummy's Ghost, House of Frankenstein, The Mummy's Curse, etc., etc., etc. Now, it's not, the same actors playing a lot of these by this point. Boris Karloff is out, Lon Chaney's out, Bela Lugosi's out, and you have people sort of stepping into these roles, especially Lon Chaney Jr. He goes on to play the Wolfman. He has some roles in The Mummy, things like that. But they just keep making these movies. And they're very popular, but like anything else, when you start to get a lot of movies that come out, there reaches a point where they've become passé, perhaps. They've become too normal. And so to kind of maybe give it a little more oomph after the war, there is a combination of genres, the horror monster genre and the classic comedy genre. So in 1948, you get Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. And this is Bela Lugosi returning as the classic Dracula from 1925. But hopefully you know who Abbott and Costello are. They are a comedy troupe. So what you have is these movies that had originally been built around suspense and fear and haunting and bad things happening, and it sort of takes a quirky turn into self-parody. And that's really what these movies had almost become closer to the end. But by the time you get to Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, it is definitely a parody of themselves. They run into Frankenstein's monster, they get the Wolfman, they get Dracula, they're all chasing them through a castle. Comedy hijinks ensue. It's hilarious, but it's not the classic monster movie anymore. They're sort of basically having to make fun of themselves to continue that. Now, one other thing happens. They continue to make some of these movies, but the golden age is winding down by the 1950s. And in 1954, you get the last of the classic monsters, the creature from the Black Lagoon. And it's actually played by two people. Ben Chapman plays the creature acting and when he's walking around. And then Raku Browning plays the monster when he's actually swimming underwater. I can't imagine having this rig on and being underwater. It must have been absolutely frightening. But this is really the last of the classic monsters that are created. And this one, I don't think this is anything more than based on legend and just the classic, there's something in that water, wonder what it could be, don't go in there. That sort of thing is what the creature from the Black Lagoon is really has its roots in. And only a couple of, they make a couple of more creature from the Black Lagoon movies. And in 1956, they have The Creature Among Us, which is where scientists, it's always scientists, by the way, in the 1950s. Have you noticed that? A couple of scientists get the creature and make it so that he can breathe air and he walks on land. And then The Creatures Among Us. And in 1956, that really sets up the end of the classic monster genre. Why is that? Again, saturation plays a large part. There were a ton of these movies going all the way back to the early 30s that they just kept making them. They just kept cranking them out. And the stories, of course, are not going to be as original. They're not going to be as surprising when you have the same characters and the same general plots. I mean, how many times can you have the curse of the mummy come and get somebody? These movies do set up this. I'm going to make a bold statement, and I'm not going to push it too far because there's a lot of people who can argue different ways, but I'm just going to go ahead and say that these classic monsters from Universal, in effect, set up the horror genre in the United States. They create it, they set a lot of the tropes, but these things have been going on for about 30 years now, and in 30 years' time, what horror can be, what people want to do with it, starts to expand. It really starts to evolve and mature. And one of the key things about horror is it needs to be created, and this sounds stupid, needs to be created to reflect the times that it's created in, right? Monsters in Castles in Transylvania are not necessarily the fears of an audience in 1960. There are a lot of different things in the world now, or in 1960, than there were in 1930. And so the evolution of audience, maturity and nuance they've just changed. And so there are still horror movies that continue to be made, but they're not the horror movies of classic monsters. The idea that there is this other thing that is different from us that we must fear or fight or something like that. If you'll notice, a lot of the horror movies following on to the 60s and moving into the 70s and certainly moving into the 80s are more the horror of the monster within ourselves, right? It's not the other. It's not some force of nature. It's us. We are the monster in some way, whether it's Freddy or Jason or any of those things. They're other, but they're people. They're not supernatural things. So a lot of these things contribute to the downfall of the classic monster. But as we said at the beginning, these things are they were popular, they continue to be popular, and they're incredibly iconic. Why is that? Well, you're going to get a different answer for each person that you ask. I have several friends who are absolute locked in hardcore aficionados of the horror genre. And even though their tastes have matured and changed too as they get older, they always seem to come back to those classic monsters. When you go to Universal Studios in Florida, if you're lucky enough to go there, they have an entire segment of the theme park there that's built around these classic monsters. We all know them. They still come out every Halloween and people see them, and they continue to get, reborn for each generation. I think one thing that makes them so iconic and so popular is that, especially the early ones, they're based on works of literature that of themselves have merit. And their roots are sunk deep enough into that good literature that they still have some of the questions and concerns that reach us as humans and as people. Even though the style of horror might be somewhat corny to us now, a lot of those things are still in there. And another thing, too, it's a continuation of fandom, right? This is something that you always have to take into account when you're talking about fandom. People who are fans of these things, of course, are going to indoctrinate their kids into this sort of thing, and their kids are going to pick up on it maybe a little later, but they're always going to remember that mom and dad like this. So they continue to be. And, of course, the return of monsters. These classic monsters never really went away. There were always remakes as they carried on. I'll be honest, one of my personal favorite movies is, Brendan Fraser in The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. I love those movies. They're well done. They're still a mummy. They take advantage of a lot of, special effects and a lot of the new audience stuff. And they're still great. And I know that recently there have been efforts by Universal and a few other studios to take these classic monster movies and the monster themes and part of the plot and they're going to start a next generation, if you will, a dark universe of a lot of these classic monsters to make them relevant for a modern audience. I'd say the old ones are still relevant for a modern audience, but everyone has their own perspectives. So classic monsters are classic for a reason. If you haven't seen them, they're widely available. I hope you get a chance to. If you have seen them, hopefully you can take a chance to share some of your thoughts with me. Now I think, Libba, we've got a few questions and comments that we can talk about. So, did European countries have horror movies too? I honestly don't know the answer to that. I think they kind of did, but I think that the classic American horror movie is probably a very American thing. We export a lot of horror. Germany kind of started it with, as we said earlier, Nosferatu and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and things like that. Metropolis is kind of a horror movie. It's got the same feel to it. That's what Sue said. That's what Sue said. Yeah, they did, but they didn't have this horror thing like we kind of have. And America cinema is one of our biggest exports, and so a lot of horror movies originate here and go out. Then Bob, there's a great article about the origin of the mummy story and its context in the European Journal of American Studies. 2 stories by Arthur Conan Doyle were central. That's very interesting. Again, that Arthur Conan Doyle is sort of writing in that early, well, not classic age of archaeology, depending on how you, but the 10s, the 20s, when people were discovering mummies like crazy in Egypt, and mysteries start to evolve with that. It's really neat. For some reason, this may surprise you. I find the ones that have a little more steeping in history to be more personally interesting to me, like the Mummy. I think Frankenstein is probably the one that has the deepest sort of secondary and tertiary messages that you can get, and it's probably the second most remade. There are people that have taken and tried to do true adaptations of Mary Shelley's book, like his name just leapt from my mind. Kenneth Branagh. Kenneth Branagh did one that was really, really good with Robert De Niro, of all people, as the monster. And it was a much more modern take and a much closer adaptation to the book. There's also, vampire movies. Again, Dracula didn't create the vampire genre, but heavens, it is one of the most popular genres of horror that goes everywhere, right? Vampire Diaries, Twilight, Interview with a Vampire, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, they're all there. Vampires because they're cool, right? The vampires seem to be the cool kids. I would argue that the vampires being cool goes back to Bela Lugosi, right? He's a count. He dresses pretty stylish in that movie. He has a cool accent that he will talk to people with, right? It's such a cool thing that when they did release Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1991 or 2 with Gary Oldman, right? That was a very popular movie, and it had a lot of effects on a lot of people. Very interesting. The Mummy has been remade. Let's see, Frankenstein. Wolfman, not so much as popular, but Teen Wolf with Michael J. Fox was a great one, if any of you have seen that. Sort of a readaptation of a classic monster story for a modern audience, so that they can kind of have a relevance to it. Invisible Man, not so much, which is interesting to me. Maybe it's because, maybe someone who's invisible watching all the time is maybe a little too creepy for a modern audience with all of our technologies and things like that. Folks, that's all I'm going to talk about today. That's all of your time I'm going to take, but I'm so glad you were willing to give me and the History Center a little bit of your time to share this really interesting story right before Halloween. So we've got some things coming up. For those of you who are close, one of the things we're very excited about is that we're going to have our first live in-person, face-to-face family day on November 8th. Is that right, Libba?
Yes.
Yes, November 8th, here on site from 1 to 4. We're going to have a lot of safety precautions in place, including registration, so that we can have some timed events. So if you want to take part in that, please go online, register for that. We're very, very excited. We haven't done one of these since April, I think it is. We haven't done anything like that. So we're going to give it a try and see if we can make it work safely. We also have some great programs coming up for you members. This month we're doing reruns for our Wednesday programs, but members, we're going to have something fresh. And I believe, is it next week when we're going to go through the suffrage exhibit on November 6th? Is that right? I'm very bad with a historian who's bad with dates. Can you imagine such a thing? November 6th, we're going to have a members preview of the suffrage party, virtual, not a preview, but a virtual tour of that. So continue to follow us on Facebook. Thank you for all of your support. Thank you for being a member. It's folks like you that make these programs and everything we do in terms of history education possible. So until I can be with you next time, I want all of you to stay safe and take care.